Vermont Council on Rural Development's Community Engagement and Policy Associate. And I also help with the Vermont Community Leadership Network, which is one of our programs. And in this program, we do workshops and we have a leadership guide that are public resources for any of Vermont's community leaders, which is all of you. And we are also soon going to be holding a summit on August 6th. And one of those tracks will probably be interesting to all the folks who have joined here. We're going to have a track on resilience and sort of thinking about that in a long-term and big picture sense, as well as the sort of day-to-day on the ground, what you guys can all do to help your communities. I also want to touch base on some Zoom housekeeping notes. For one thing, we'd like you to stay muted until through the panelists' discussion. We have 5 wonderful panelists, and we have some curated questions for them. And then after the first hour of discussion amongst them, we are going to open it up to questions that you all put in the chat. So we would like you to put any questions you have. You're welcome to put them in the chat as we go along. No need to wait until the end, but do put them in the chat and we will keep track of them, make note of them. I'm going to put them all in a spreadsheet. And at the end of the first hour, we will turn to those questions and ask them of the panelists as well. So you're welcome to like anybody else's questions that you see that you think are particularly helpful. Feel free to like those and that will boost it and bring it to our attention more. And you can also put resources that you know of in the chat. So if we're having a discussion and you hear something, somebody ask a question or somebody mention something and you know of a great resource that others should be aware of, please put that in the chat. I will be taking note of all those things as well and compiling a document and sending that out at the end. And I'll be sending that with the recording as well. So at the end of this, you and everybody who has registered will get the recording and a document of resources and a transcript of the chat so that you can see the questions that were asked and the discussion that happens there. And I think that's it from me. So I'll hand it over to Laura. Thanks so much for coming.
Great. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you all for being here today. I'm Laura Cavan-Bailey, and I'm the Climate Economy Program Manager with VCRD, and I'll be moderating the conversation today. And now is the point where it's 10 months after the July 2023 flooding and just 5 months after the December flooding. So it reminds us that these occurrences of heavy rainfall are just going to keep happening into the future with devastating impacts to individuals and collective communities. Doug Farnham, the Chief Recovery Officer, shared last fall that the human capacity to keep the learning front of mind from a disaster starts to diminish over time, and that 10 months out, it really begins to fade. So that's why we're holding this space today to collectively look back at what is still front of mind for all of you, but recognize that they're really imperfect systems, and sometimes these are in conflict with each other, and that people throughout the state are still completely devastated by these events. But we also know that there's so much potential to move forward and to create that space to imagine a future that we want to see. So we know it's not an easy path, and there are still many impacted by the floods. But we're holding this space today to highlight some of those challenges, unearth ideas for addressing them, as well as thinking forward across the spectrum of people and organizations doing this work. So we're gathered here with 5 panelists that really could speak for days about what was done and what's needed for a better future from the spectrum of individuals, neighborhoods, municipalities, watersheds, and the greater community that we live in. And we also recognize that there's immense overlapping circles that factor into what community resilience and recovery is, including food systems, technical watershed flood mitigation, response efforts, and so many more. And we couldn't have all of those people speaking today. So I do want to plug our summit on August 6th, where we will be able to have more conversations in different veins. And today we're focusing on the impact of people and a few specific points on that spectrum. So some individuals, municipalities, and the state. And so many folks, in addition, are with us today on the call and others who've registered. And so we wanted to give space to hear from all of you who've tuned in today. And upon registration, we asked, what is top of mind for you today? And what is needed for a resilient future? And here is what you said: community, planning, collaboration, inclusion, and so much more. All of this is needed to move the work forward. So with that, I will turn it over to each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly and describe their role or their organization's role in the flood recovery and future resilience. And I will start with Sarah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Sarah Henshaw. I'm the coordinator for the long-term recovery group, or affectionately known as the LTRGs, in Lamoille County. We call our group the Lamoille Area Recovery Network. There are about 9, maybe a little bit more LTRGs that are working throughout the state. We all are structured differently, but our main purpose is to be the main kind of advocate, liaison, coordinator of individual and household level support for folks that have been impacted by the flooding. Yeah, I'll stop there. Have lots to say always.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Julie, can you share?
Sure. So I am Julie Hintz. I am the town manager in Chester. Chester is kind of south central Vermont. We were one of the large small towns that was greatly impacted during the flood. And I'll leave that there.
Right, thank you. Bonnie.
Thanks, Laura. I'm Bonnie Waninger. I'm the Federal Funding Assistance Specialist with the Vermont League of Cities and Towns, and our program helps municipalities with project development and funding access. When there's a statewide disaster, it's kind of an all hands on deck situation. And when the July flood occurred, we started getting lots of questions about lots of things. Sometimes we were the flagger saying, your question goes here, your question goes there. And other times we have to pivot to help new town officials understand public assistance. As the work transitioned to flood recovery, we've been holding monthly flood recovery meetings, and we worked with the Treasurer's Office on the Municipal Climate Recovery Fund. And we are still, and continue to for a while, answer more questions about how to finance disaster recovery work, how to meet federal requirements, who can answer my question about public assistance, and how you move into recovery planning and implementation.
Great, thanks, Bonnie. Pat.
Good morning. My name is Pat Moulton, and I am the Central Vermont Flood Recovery Officer. I work in the Agency of Administration. I work for Doug Farnham, who was referenced earlier. To my knowledge, I think I'm the first full-time flood recovery officer, other than the chief recovery officer, that we've had. There are 2 others of me who work part-time. They work mainly for the Agency of Transportation, but Holly Hayden and Doug Eaton play my role part-time in the north and south. I work in the Winooski River corridor. My primary responsibility is long-term recovery, helping communities look at what are those mitigation and other strategies they should be looking at. I do engage to some degree with individual assistance if it means trying to break up a log jam or a bottleneck. So that is my role, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, and Eric.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me here today. My name's Eric Peterson. I'm the program manager for the Disaster Case Management Program at Capstone Community Action. The program's a FEMA-funded program granted to the state of Vermont as one of the individual assistance programs the state of Vermont applied for and was awarded. The award in the program gives us 9 case managers and 2 construction coordinators statewide to supplement the ongoing recovery efforts. And our program launched in January. And just on a little bit of a personal note, I was actually a disaster case manager during Tropical Storm Irene and the recovery for that, which was the last disaster where the state of Vermont was awarded an individual assistance program from FEMA. So I returned to Capstone to help be a part of this program.
Great, thank you all. So that gives the perspective of who's here with us today. And now we'll go back to Sarah and have you speak to what's top of mind right now, or what have you learned in regards to the 2023 flooding?
Great, thank you. Lots of things are top of mind, as you can imagine. A couple things just about our group. We Learn is actually a collaborative of all of our health and human service organizations that work in Lamoille County. So we have folks that represent pretty much the full continuum of our health and human service organizations in the county, which is important to kind of lay the groundwork for all the connections and referrals that we're able to make for the households that we are working with, and to make sure that, you know, if they're needed, if more health and human service support is needed, we're able to connect them to those bigger kind of system of care across. I just wanted to kind of give that background, but for us, you know, there's kind of 2 big things that are top of mind. One, construction season. I'm sure nobody, this is, you know, it's Vermont, it is construction season. A lot of households really made it through the winter, you know, with kind of bare bone homes and some, you know, heating support and assistance. But now as things are kind of warming up, construction season is starting. We carry about 50 households on our case management list, you know, kind of varying week to week. Of those, there's a couple of things that are emerging. One, septic systems seem to be failing across the board because of all the sediment that's settled into them. 2, a lot of families over the winter, you know, did their very, very best to try to do as much repair as they possibly could with their savings, their retirement, the FEMA that they could get. If they did get any insurance, they used it. And so now we're coming out of the winter and saying, oh my God, I don't have any money left over, but we have all these repairs left to do. And so, you know, those 2 pieces together are really, and it's construction season in Vermont. Did I mention that? And so every contractor is already working on a lot of other projects, or it's already booked. So we're kind of at that convergence of, you know, people that may not have ever been in the health and human service system before, may have never have had to ask for help, that may have been, you know, solidly middle class to income, you know, households now having to figure out how to navigate systems that are foreign and challenging and hard and not very human friendly. And the need for construction, which is hard to come by in Vermont because. So that's kind of the top of mind. Underneath that is mental health, right? Every time it storms and rains, families are freaked out, are scared, you know, and even families that have been successful in repairing their house, may have replaced some of their items, you know, may have been really lucky and been able to do some kind of mitigation around their house to help support not having rainwaters come in. They're still scared when it rains, right? And so, you know, I think we as a community need to think about how do we community heal, and we haven't really figured that piece out yet. And I think we're still kind of struggling with that. And the last thing I was just going to point to in kind of in terms of learning, we've learned a lot. You know, we as an organization didn't exist at the time of the floods, but we used the structure that we had used during COVID as a community to come together and say, oh, we can respond. And we did some response. But over time, we've kind of formed this long-term recovery group. In forming that long-term recovery group, you know, we've learned things like it's really hard to do community outreach. In our time of doing community outreach, we've done door-to-doors multiple times in all the communities that were hard hit. We have done radio ads, we have done resource fairs, yet there's still people that have not heard of us and don't know we exist, and don't know how to get help. And there's data that exists in the state that we were not given access to. So it took us a long time to get access to FEMA assistance list. We were not given access to 211 data. So if any community member that had called 211, we did not ever get that information. And so I think there's a lot of systemic things that we as a state need to start to think about, and connecting these kind of newer long-term recovery groups that are really focused on the day-to-day of helping families and working with families who are in kind of the thick of their own recovery journey with larger state systems. And I think that's where we need to focus so that the next time this happens, which is going to happen, we're not stuck 10 months out still with families that are in situations where, you know, they shouldn't be. They just shouldn't be. So I think that I'll end there. I won't use my full 5 minutes to give you back some time for other panelists, but those are kind of the top of mind for me right now.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. You spoke to a lot right there, and some ideas even sort of moving forward what we need. So Julie, let's hear from you. What is top of mind as you look at Chester as a municipality, and what have you learned in regards to the flooding of last year?
Great, thank you. Yes, I think in going along a little bit of what Sarah was saying is the number one thing we've learned is this isn't the last time we're going to do this, right? Like, so for those of us who were here during Irene, and then some of those littler floodings in between Irene and July, and then December, like this is a common occurrence, and the 100 years is apparently not 100 years anymore, right? It's a shorter span. So Chester has this event for us identified several things that we didn't have issues with during Irene, but we seemed to this time, and it really focused centrally around communication. Communication between departments within the municipality during the event, us communicating with the public. There seemed to be just a tremendous amount of gaps. And then us communicating with the state. There were some shortfalls there as well. And I think that as these events become more and more frequent, communication becomes more and more important. And so Chester has a few things that we are working on as far as improving that communication internally and out with our community. We had a few situations of where during the event, so Chester has 97 miles of dirt road. So we are a small town. We have a lot of dirt, and we have 4 branches of the Williams River all converge in Chester. So we have a lot of water and a lot of dirt. They don't play well together during an event. So we had guys out in different sections of town whose radios went down. I had one truck with an operator in it who actually got isolated on a little island, and we couldn't get to him. And so really dangerous situations. These did not happen during Irene, but they did during this event. And he couldn't communicate out with anybody. We went out and checked on him because the guys had not heard from him in well over an hour. So just those types of situations are scary. The other thing is we just couldn't seem to get it together enough to be able to communicate well to the public. We rely so heavily on social media, which just doesn't work. It does to a degree, but then there's a lot of the demographic that they don't do social media, right? Or they've lost power. Like, so how are they supposed to get on social media? So just how do we communicate better, letting people know which roads are closed? Please stay home. Yes, the rivers have crested. All of those types of communication efforts. The other thing that we identified is this time around is that Chester, we really don't have adequate emergency shelters. Not just a shelter, even just a warming shelter. And the 2 places that we've identified in the years past, actually get cut off during an event. So they're just outside of our village, and that's always where the river crests. And so we can put people there, but then emergency services can't get to them if something were to happen. So we are going to be looking at strategically placing a few warming shelters throughout towns at different locations, and really just honing in on some of those things. And we are establishing a better relationship with our community members so that during an event, everybody is involved, everybody is informed, and everybody can be a part, not only of getting through the event, but of the recovery of the event itself. The other thing I would say that's kind of top of mind, Chester was fortunate in that we were able to navigate through it, but I have heard from many towns that funding right after an event, current expense funding is really an issue for municipalities. Chester, again, we have a budget of just about 4 million, and our damages were over 2.5 million. So the way the flood landed, it for Chester was actually, I guess, a decent time because we had just collected taxes. But for those municipalities who had no tax revenue at that time, they're shelling out $2.5 million. Where is that money coming from? And you can do a current expense note, but it's going to get paid back within 1 year. You can't do that when FEMA is reimbursing much slower this time for all kinds of reasons, but that's just what's happening. And the bond bank came in with a program that really tried to help, but for our 2.5 million, Chester was eligible for just under 300,000. So helpful, but not helpful. And so I think the state needs to look at how can we help. I don't know. I hate to propose problems and then not have solutions. I don't know how that would work with funding, but that is a big struggle for municipalities that are still outlaying a lot of cash and not getting reimbursement back. So I will leave it there and let other panelists have more time, but our focus and top of mind for us is how do we communicate better during the next event.
Great, thanks, Julie. And we recognize there may not be all the answers here today. Unfortunately, we wish there could be, but I think there's an opportunity to start talking about creative solutions moving forward. So Bonnie, let's move to your perspective of what's top of mind now.
What's top of mind for me is that preparedness pays off. So we're thinking a lot right now across the state of making our roads and facilities more flood resilient and taking care of people who are flood impacted. But I think you just heard from Julie, for disasters, municipalities operate alone for those first 72 hours. You have to figure out what's happening on the ground and address the most critical issues. And that disaster response takes time to organize, even when we knew rain was coming, right? And we knew it was going to be bad. But I've talked to some water and wastewater operators who said that was over the weekend, and people informed us via email, which we read Monday morning when we got to the office and were pretty much in the thick of things. So those communication systems are critical. But it's also having those documents. How seriously does your municipality take your local emergency management plan? Do you have a continuity of operations plan? Have you practiced those plans under different scenarios before you're in the thick of disaster? And it sounds funny to say that, but I will say that preparedness also means having other systems in place. There's the emergency response ones, but there's also communication, Julie mentioned, financial and programmatic things you need to make your finances work better. Municipalities are borrowing money all over the place to cover these. We look to the state for assistance, in part because we weren't prepared for the level of damage that happened. So what's top of mind? Preparedness. Will your voters allow you to have that savings account, your rainy day fund for just such a thing? But it's also certain documents where you we tap FEMA frequently in Vermont for different types of disasters. Those municipalities who had already incorporated federal requirements into their processes and policies are faring better in public assistance than those who hadn't. Simple things like, what's a road maintenance plan? And that can be pretty simple for FEMA to accept, but they want it in writing. We kind of developed disaster amnesia after Irene, and that's not a criticism, that's common, right? We move out of response into recovery, and we never take the time to jot down our thoughts of the moment, what worked, what didn't work. So the last piece I'll say is that we forgot, or we weren't prepared. We had such a turnover in municipal officials. 1/3 of municipal officials turned over in March 2023. And by July, they were getting their feet wet on what their role was, but they hadn't really dived into what's our disaster role yet. So what does the municipality have in place for those new members to help them settle into those roles, to pull that binder off the shelf and say, who do we talk to? How do we do it? Where's our outlets for communication? Those kinds of things help. The very last piece I'll hit is time. Most municipal officials work full-time elsewhere to earn a living, right? When disaster strikes, we're kind of asking them to drop their paying job. I know one municipal official who may be on this, who essentially took 2 weeks vacation to get their municipality in line because they had no municipal staff. That was not the most enjoyable vacation of his life. And at the end of that response, and it was an extended thing, we were exhausted going into recovery. So self-care is an important thing for all of us, not just preparing our municipalities, but preparing our families and looking at what our own risk is. I forgot to time myself, Laura, so I will stop there. But
You're doing
preparedness
great.
is the message. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Bonnie. It's a great perspective of just thinking across the state of municipalities that are reaching out to Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Pat, let's hear from you next.
Thanks, Laura. I'm going to riff for a minute off Bonnie and Sarah, because I do think we have to recognize the PTSD that communities and people are going to feel. Those of us who were engaged with Irene, those 4 days in July were torture. And recognizing the emotional toll that takes on people and community infrastructure. And so I think that mental health piece is really critical. But other things that are top of mind for me, and God bless Eric Peterson and Capstone and the work they're doing with the disaster case managers, but we didn't get those disaster case managers on the ground till 6-7 months after the disaster. They need to be out day one. So we have to set up an ability to have them on the job immediately. And that means some preparedness, additional planning during the blue skies event, as FEMA likes to call them, so that we're ready when the time comes and we're not searching all over to try to find people who can do that. And connected with that is needing a recovery network that also outlasts the disaster. I mean, these kinds of disaster recovery is a marathon, not a sprint. And to Bonnie's point too, we do get a little, the distance from the emergency, we get a little amnesia, and we can't let that happen. And we've got to remember that this kind of recovery and resilience is a long-term struggle. So developing statewide resources that are available, whether it's to put disaster case managers on the ground, to fill gaps for municipalities, but most critically to look at how we can stand up a statewide network that's going to be valuable for all kinds of disaster recovery, whether it's a localized or a statewide like we saw in July or December. But another key piece, I think, is recognizing, to the point that Bonnie brought up also, a lot of these folks in municipalities have another full-time job. They're on select boards, but they work elsewhere. And the full-time people have to sleep. So there has to be some time for them to recover. So getting some technical assistance into the hands of municipalities. And yes, the municipal technical assistance program is helpful, but I talked to at least one regional planning commission who said, they're overwhelmed with the demands of that MTAP program that we have stood up in Vermont. Another key thing that I have found in my work is people need to better understand river dynamics and what hydrology and fluvial geomorphology, throw that out at a cocktail party, people will be impressed. But what does that mean? And so that we can recognize the importance of reconnecting rivers to floodplains, to looking at mitigating bridges that might be too low. And there has to be really a community understanding of what that science is. We learned to trust science in COVID. We need to learn to trust science in flood recovery. So we have to recognize we're just going to see more water. We've seen more since Irene. It won't be 12 years since till we do another one, as we learned in December, and it's going to come faster. So we really need to look at how are we going to build our infrastructure with increasing water. And as a recovering economic developer myself, you know, in the early days when I'd say, oh, we'll just fill in that floodplain and build, we have to recognize, no, we've got to find alternate locations. We've got to let the rivers have their room so the water will slow down, so it'll be less impactful downstream, and recognize that what happens upstream impacts what's downstream. And so there really needs to be a corridor approach to this work. And that's actually some work that I'm working on right now, is how we can have some regional meetings around the river corridor, looking at projects we've already identified and really moving the needle to get those implemented. So those are just a few things I'll share to start, and happy to answer questions later.
Great, thanks, Pat. And Eric, let's hear what's front of mind for you right now.
Thank you. And thank you so much for the kind words, Pat. And I guess the problem with going last, I just want to ditto so much of what everybody before me said. And I swear I did do the homework assignment. I'm not just going to plagiarize everything that everybody who went before me said here. I did jot out a few things, but yeah, a lot of what's top of mind for me has certainly already been shared and said at this point. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I was a disaster case manager back during Tropical Storm Irene. And one of the first things I learned very quickly getting back involved in the recovery for this disaster was that every disaster is a little bit different and poses a unique set of challenges. And with this one, there's some major challenges that did not exist during the Irene recovery that have created a steep learning curve for a lot of the work that we've been involved in here. So the first one, some of this has been mentioned before, there's a real shortage of skilled labor in the state right now. Licensed contractors and tradespeople are often booked out for many months. And as Sarah mentioned, it's building season. That cannot be overstated. And during Irene, we could get estimates in a week, and within a couple months, we could have contractors on site getting to work on jobs that they had done estimates for a couple months earlier. In-state volunteer groups are limited, and we're increasingly having to rely on out-of-state volunteer groups in the coming months. So with the out-of-state volunteer groups coming in to do the work, this takes a tremendous amount of coordination, having to recruit the groups into the state, find enough similar jobs in reasonable proximity to each other that are shovel ready to go. You have to coordinate housing, food, and transportation for these groups, having to have tools and equipment and the necessary building materials on site for these groups. So this is a huge undertaking for the volunteer long-term recovery groups that are involved in having to do this, as well as the Capstone's programs, 2 construction coordinators. So this is turning out to be a big challenge that we did not face during Irene. One of the other big challenges that's really been top of mind here for us in our program is the lack of affordable housing and the resulting pressure created by the tight rental market there. The lack of affordable housing and that's resulted in pressure that's created a tight rental market, sorry. And that's one of the big issues that we didn't face during Irene. And during Irene, by the time the disaster case management program came online, most renters had received their money from FEMA. They had replaced lost personal items and furniture, and they were able to go out and find available apartments to rent on their own. We had very few rental cases on our caseload during Irene. Today, we're seeing a number of displaced renters and homeowners who are forced to live with friends and family members as they sit on waiting lists for affordable housing units, or they're applying, competing against a large pool of unhoused individuals for limited numbers of available rental units coming up on the market. So that's something we're really seeing that has been focusing our attention. One thing that I think we're definitely seeing that this recovery has in common with Irene, disasters like this really tend to shine a spotlight on larger issues concerning poverty and generational poverty. So as we work with survivors who have difficulty navigating the recovery process on their own, we often encounter numerous issues pertaining to poverty and generational poverty. We encounter challenges around food insecurity, other affordability issues such as transportation challenges, affording utilities like electricity and heating costs. We see unmet medical needs, especially untreated mental health related needs. So those are just a few of the challenges we encounter. And that's just scratching the surface of some of the things that we're seeing now and we saw during Irene. But all of these needs become obstacles to the recovery process and often need to be addressed before individuals that we're working with, or that I think the long-term recovery groups as well, have to work with the survivors around and help them reach out and get those services and get those needs addressed before they're ready to really start focusing on the recovery process around property damage and working on the habitability issues in their homes and property created by the storm.
Great, thanks, Eric. And you'll have an opportunity now to tee up the next question of, as we just looked back and started to think forward of what's needed going into the next portion of time that we see ourselves here. And so what's needed for the next recovery process, and or what's needed for the future that you want to see? And Eric, let's tee up. You go first.
I'm going first on this. Okay,
yes,
very good. Right. So I want to come back a little bit to my original point that I started out with about each disaster being different and kind of posing its own set of unique challenges. And this kind of ties in a little bit to what you mentioned around Doug Farnham's comment earlier about just how the collective attention can kind of get exhausted over time with these recovery processes. So we have so many hardworking, dedicated volunteers that have been tirelessly putting in countless hours within the long-term recovery groups in our state since July. And as we come into this building season, we need a lot more volunteers to jump in and assist the long-term recovery groups of the repair and rebuild projects. This disaster just does not have the level of visibility that Irene had, it feels like. Some of this, we don't have the real stunning visuals that we had during Irene. Like, we don't have houses sitting on riverbanks a year after the disaster that people are driving by every day, keeping people's focus and attention on recovery efforts. And as we're coming into this building season, we really need to find a way to refocus people's attention back on the need for more people to get involved in their community's recovery efforts and lend a hand with the repair and rebuild jobs. We've got a real narrow window of time. So whatever we can do on the community level to get more people out and involved in the process during this time period is going to be critical. Just another thought on the future of the recovery process. Our program and the long-term recovery groups need to work with towns and municipalities around long-term visions. And some of this ties into what Pat was saying at the end of her last, the closing of her what she was saying in the pertaining to the last question. So we've built a lot of our towns and city centers and river valleys are near waterways. And because of our changing climate and the frequency and severity of storms and the frequency and severity of storms and flooding events will increase. And we need to work with towns and villages around long-range planning involving hazard mitigation, utilizing things like the buyout program and elevation program when these opportunities present themselves after disasters. There needs to be a coordination of long-range planning around water systems and their dynamics. We need plans created to give waterways places to go during severe storm events that reduce the risk of serious property damage and losses in the future. As we work on recovery efforts, some of our work is dependent upon what the long-range vision for flood-prone areas is. As we help survivors make decisions around their recovery, we kind of need to know what these future plans are going to look like so we can help advise them on those decisions and what they're going to do with their property.
Great, thanks, Eric. And now, Pat, what do you see the need is to do next in this recovery process and or to get the future that we want to see to get there?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I've got obviously some ideas on both of those. I mean, immediately next, technical assistance for municipalities to work on their buyouts and elevations and hazard mitigation, I see as a huge need. And USDA Rural Development just announced last week $1 million in funding that can be available for hiring some additional assistance in municipalities. So I would encourage you to reach out to USDA to see. I don't know enough about that process yet, but that can hopefully help some towns get some help. A next thing that's critically important for municipalities is to prepare for the hazard mitigation program grants that are coming towards the end of this year in the next few months. Vermont is slated to receive in excess of $75 million in hazard mitigation funds because of the scope of our disaster. The legislature is currently debating. Governor Scott has recommended in his budget funding to meet the 25% match that's required. So in theory, we have $100 million coming that can help us raise bridges, create floodplain, mitigate hazards. But we have to start identifying, prioritizing those projects, start looking at the scoping needed, probably hire engineers. It's work to get a hazard mitigation program grant together, but regional planning commissions and others can help with that. Another thing for communities is to really start finalizing any kind of buyouts and elevations. And I know it's a painful process, as Bobby Brimblecom's mentioned in Marshfield. A lot of people ask, but not everybody's going to get a yes. And so it's a tough process for towns to go through. But long term, I think, back to Eric's point, yep, let's understand how water flows and what we need to do to be prepared. But also municipalities, especially those participating in the National Flood Insurance Program, are required to have hazard mitigation plans. We need to have hazard mitigation plans and work them. I mean, it's no different than zoning bylaws. You've got to have the plan and implement the plan and not leave them on the shelf. So I think those are some immediate things that have to happen. But as a state, we've really got to work on what that permanent recovery network work looks like. How we make sure that we don't forget this when it stops raining, and that we're staying on these opportunities to train local officials, train disaster case managers, be ready to stand up, get the long-term recovery groups. I'm amazed and impressed at how organizations like Sarah's and others have stood up and done amazing work. But what's going to happen when Sarah decides she doesn't want to do it the next time? Who are the next people that are coming in? How do we engage young people? So those permanent recovery networks, some which will have to be staffed, who can then provide that support to municipalities, I think is critical. And I look to the legislature for that. We also have to look at the social inequity that's happening around Vermont. I mean, mobile home parks are built along rivers and brooks because that's where the land is cheap. And who can least afford to rebuild their house? Those very same people. So how do we as a state address some of our land use priorities, and how do we get these people out of harm's way? And included in that is some coordinated housing response. To Eric's point, we have inadequate housing in Vermont. It's a problem we've been struggling with for a while now. How do we prioritize flood affected housing? What does that mean if we do that? And how can we have, I mean, this is being debated endlessly in the legislature, how we're going to fund and prioritize housing development. But if we don't do it, not only does our economy suffer, and it has suffered by the fact that we have workforce shortages, but those are we're going to run into this story of inadequate housing over and over again. So the time is now to get this work done. And so those are just some initial thoughts that I have. So thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Bonnie, let's hear from you. What is next in the recovery process, or what do we need to do for the future?
Okay, and I'm going to be very brief on this one. I talked about preparedness, and I think that what we found at VLCT, working directly with municipalities, is that being prepared for disaster starts with having a fundamental grasp of municipal finance, operations, and management practices. That's not the glitzy gold star stuff. It's not the things most volunteers want to jump into, but the basic functions of government, the finance, the operations, the management. Municipal leaders who had good accounting practices in place, or good contracting policies enacted, or a basic understanding of grants management before last summer's storms they're making it through the FEMA process. They're making it through the financial process of how do we pay for these disasters easier. And Pat, that $1 million just says that if it's the same million I'm thinking of, VLCT was awarded $1 million by USDA through a disaster recovery technical assistance program to help build those skills in both career and volunteer local leaders across Vermont. So again, that's a municipal assistance program, but the goal is to help enable them to respond to not just this disaster, but the future ones as well. And with those systems in place, if they pursue grants, if they don't, if they take out loans, if they do something else to finance, it makes those processes work so much easier as our volunteers rotate through, because we will. Somebody might be there 12 years, somebody else might be there 1 year. But to develop those basic preparedness things, it won't stop us from having disasters. It will help us manage them better. So that's where I'm focusing my time today. Thanks.
Thanks, Bonnie. Great to know that those resources are going to be available for municipalities around the state. And Julie, let's hear from you.
So Chester, keeping in line with our communication issue, Chester has taken several strides. We, through some grant funding through Vermont Community Foundation, so we are establishing a CERT, which is a Certified Emergency Response Team. This is made up of community members. We are starting with a team of 20, and these are people that are trained in traffic control. They're trained as first responders, so that during an event, our focus is during the event. We can deploy these CERT teams out to assist emergency services in blocking a road, in reaching our most vulnerable populations. You know, that's another thing that we're working on, is establishing a good database of who is our most vulnerable population, that as soon as this event begins, or if we know it's coming, we usually know 24 hours ahead of time that they're anticipating a major rain event. Connecting with those people prior to the event to say, you know, just want you to know we are here, please call, we will check in throughout this storm. So we are establishing those databases. The other thing we have done is we did invest relatively small dollars, $4,000, to get a Catalyst account. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Catalyst. It's the old-fashioned robocall system, except it's modernized now. So it will send a message via text, via email, and via phone call. It is a way that we can reach everybody. So second homeowners can sign up. I mean, anybody who has property or is a resident of Chester can receive notification. Building that database will take time. But we are going to be taking advantage of our elections this year as good opportunities to get people signed up. So those are some of the things that we have done. We also have applied for funding through, keeping up with our communications equipment, to include things like cell boosters in the dump trucks, so that we are able to better communicate internally throughout an event. And we have a new public safety building that was built about 3 years ago. Back to Pat's point about you have a hazard mitigation plan or a hazard plan, dig it off the shelf and use it. We were supposed to have all deployed over to the public safety building, and we didn't. And admin stayed and over here at town hall, and it just created such a confusion in flow of information. So we are doing quarterly now, all staff. We have basically tabletop discussions over the public safety building to say, here is what we do during an event so that we can keep it top of mind. And so that everybody does know their role. This is your role. During Irene, I was not the town manager. I was the assistant town manager. So my role was different. This event, I was the town manager. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh my word, what's my role? What am I supposed to do? So these tabletop discussions are really helpful for us internally, and then is helping us communicate department wise about those high risk areas where we know it always floods, and what are the things that we can be doing. We take advantage of hazard mitigation grants all the time. And so are identifying those projects when that funding comes out. But ours is really focusing on during the event, and how do we make these events more tolerable as they come, and how can we get through them much easier, not just the recovery on the other side, but during the event itself. So I think that these are initiatives that are certainly our community is excited about, and I think will help us in future events.
Great, thanks, Julie, for sharing what Chester is moving forward, and how other towns may be able to tap into some of that process that you're speaking to. So Sarah, let's hear from you. What do you need to do next in the recovery process, but also what do we need for the future that you want to see?
No, great. It's hard to be last. I now appreciate that the challenge of being last. I will say a couple things. One, I agree. We're focused on the individual and household level support and long-term recovery, and this piece of the continuum of disaster kind of management. There isn't kind of a function at the state level or the local level that is formalized at this point. And what that means is then we're missing out on data. We're missing out on connections to kind of be a part of the planning process. And so we need to be incorporated. We as in LTRGs need to be incorporated in across the board in the emergency management kind of spectrum, to ensure that when the long-term recovery is stood up and needed, where we have the information, the data, and kind of the connections to be able to do our job well, and not have to, what we're doing, all of us are doing now, is we're kind of building the boat as we're floating in it, right? And so we're always kind of 1 or 2 steps behind, and which leaves families and households, without the support that they really need in their own recovery journey. So, as I am not an emergency manager, so and neither are any of my fellow LTRG members, and so we're learning as we go. For Learn, we have good connections with our towns, and are hoping that those connections with the towns will help in terms of next emergency. And we've already seen that really helped when there was actually a local fire that infected a big multi-unit property here. That connection's already helping us help respond and provide support over the long term. We're in connection with our regional planning commission to make sure that we're talking to them about how to be incorporated into the different planning processes that are happening. I think at the state level, we need to think about what does that look like, and how do we take the state level plan and make sure that there's some sort of function for long-term recovery for individuals that's incorporated into that plan, to make sure that local level towns and municipalities are thinking about who should that be and how does that function happen. Especially to the disaster case manager role and need in the state. If, you know, it didn't exist before Capstone getting their grant. If FEMA if we don't declare a federal disaster, that function won't exist with any federal dollars. Therefore, we need to think about what does that really mean for us in the community level. And I would argue that the LTRGs are that. Therefore, we should be focusing our effort on empowering and providing the systems that are needed so that function sits at the community level and not at Capstone. Love you guys at Capstone, but it needs to really function at the LTRG level. Like and it's not at this point. So that I think needs to happen. I'll switch gears a little bit about the buyouts. I mean, I worry about buyouts. We have people on our buyouts that are on our, you know, on our caseload. Those are going to take 12 months at minimum, maybe 60 months. We don't know. But, you know, those are not just single family homes, but multi-unit home, unit properties. So you know, we're talking about, you know, hundreds, maybe, you know, hundreds of families that are going to be homeless and not be able to afford a new house in 12 to 60 months across the state. And so there's that level, but then there's also the municipal planning level. A lot, the municipalities that I'm, you know, in communication with, they're allowing the buyouts to happen because they're thinking of the individuals, but they're not thinking about the regions or the places. So you have places where there's 5 houses that are in buyout with 3 neighbor houses that are not, all still at risk for flooding. So, you know, are we thinking about that and part of the hazard mitigation? And I, you know, and especially since there isn't a lot of funding out there for hazard mitigation at the individual level, that just doesn't exist. And we've been looking for it for a long time. And so those families that do want to stay because that's their home, there's not a lot of funding available to help protect their homes if they want to stay. So I'm thinking about those families. And again, I'm going to go back to community healing. We need to learn from these past events, but we also need to figure out how do we heal together as community so that we're more resilient for the next event that's going to ensure to come. End there, Laura.
Great, thanks everyone. And it is 11 right now. So folks who do need to step off the call, you're welcome to do that. We're going to take the next 30 minutes and go through the questions that are coming through in the chat. So folks on the Zoom room with us here today, please put your chat or your questions into the chat. And then if there are ones that you really want to see answered, like those, and we'll get to as many as we can here in the first 30 minutes. As well as some of the comments may be available for additional resources or after from our panelists. And so we'll get to what we can and then provide a follow-up after that. So I'm going to start with one kind of pulling off of Sarah's last comment there about the land and the existing infrastructure. So someone noted here that we have large properties going through the buyout with only a small part of property that's impacted by the flooding. So once the buyout happens, the town will own this unbuildable land that won't be available for housing. Is there a way to think about that differently or approach those scenarios in new ways? And really for anyone on the panel to speak to. Yes, Pat.
Yeah, I'd happily take a stab at that. And at least I know Barry's having conversations about potentially doing buyouts that are not FEMA funded so that they are not permanently restricted from development. Of course, the challenge there is, does the municipality have the funding to do that buyout? But that's a strategy depending on your municipality. But I think it's also really taking a good hard look at what properties are requesting a buyout, and are they in fact going to help with mitigation, and or are these properties with people who are in harm's way? What caused the flooding? Was it because there was a bridge that acted like a dam or an undersized culvert? Those are the kinds of things that have to be analyzed. And because a lot of people, might say, I just don't want to do this again. And I'm sure, Bobby, who wrote that message, I'm sure you're looking at a lot of this, but there's a difference between, hey, I got water in my basement every time it rains hard, and I had 2 feet of water or 4 feet of water in my first floor. And that's a tough place to put municipalities in. But yes, I do think it's important to look at where are those properties, and also what mitigation could be done elsewhere in the community upstream that might actually lower your base flood elevation. Now, my river engineers friends would tell me there is no silver bullet. There's no one answer. And what's ultimately going to help with mitigation is looking at a comprehensive approach of how to reconnect rivers with floodplains, how to remove bridges, how to remove dams. There was a question there about dams. I mean, the Friends of the Winooski, which I'm most familiar with, has spent a lot of time looking at dams and taking them out. My former hometown of Londonderry has a dam in its downtown that they don't seem to want to part with, but if it weren't there, it would have a different flooding scenario in downtown. So those are the kinds of things that have to be analyzed. And I know it's tough for municipalities, and ultimately you want a river engineer or someone to come and say, where do I get my best bang for the buyout buck? And that's a tough question to answer right now. But I think it comes down to, unfortunately, exercising the muscle on the municipal level to say, I'm sorry, we can't do this buyout for some of the reasons mentioned, and or just the sheer volume. And I know that's not an easy answer, but happy to chat offline about that as well.
Thanks, Pat. Does any of the other panelists want to speak to that comment? All right, maybe we'll switch to this one question. It's, why isn't the state offering low interest loans for homeowners for flood recovery repairs? Similar programs have been offered for municipalities, but not the individual homeowners. And I want to also expand that to what other ideas to support those individual homeowners in this process that has been clearly challenging given the housing shortage and need for continued capital to actually improve or to remediate and move forward in some structures that are still habitable. So sort of broadening it to what ideas are out there to support individuals more holistically. Eric.
I'm not saying the state shouldn't necessarily be offering a low interest loan program, but to speak to your question about what else is available out there, there are a variety of financial resources out there. It becomes a bit of a challenge in that a lot of them have different application processes, different qualifications for them, different income thresholds. So you have like the SBA loan program, which they had an individual assistance loan program in addition to the one for disaster affected businesses. You had the direct grant money from FEMA as an available opportunity for people who qualified for that. There's people who had insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program who are able to get funds through that. Depending upon the nature of the damage, some people's insurance covered that. Then there's other programs out there like the USDA program, which has its own set of criteria for qualifying. They have both a grant and a loan program. Unfortunately, the amount that they pay out was recently reduced due to federal budget cuts in the last couple of weeks from something in the ballpark of 43,000 down to 15,000. Vermont is fairly unique, and to our credit, we have something called the Vermont Disaster Recovery Fund, which has been taken over in the last year by the Vermont Community Foundation, administers that. That's a grant program that can be accessed through case management through long-term recovery groups or through the disaster case management program for households working through either of those systems. So it is unfortunately kind of a complicated patchwork of different sources and systems, and there's a number of the much smaller little pots of money here and there you can try to tap into and piece together funding sources. Unfortunately, it is not always adequate to meet the full need. And like I said, it is a complicated and often exhausting process for the survivor to navigate through the whole system. Sarah, am I missing anything in that?
I think you are right on about the complicated piece. I mean, I think if I had a magic wand, I would have kind of one intake, right? Instead of having people do 45 intakes, all with different information, all with different requirements. I know that there's 1,000 reasons why that isn't possible, but I put that out there for anybody who has any decision-making power to always consider that. You know, I'm an educated, privileged white woman, and I can't fill out most of the paperwork. And I have time. So, you know, I can't imagine having to do this and balance 1,000 other different things. So, you know, one intake system would be brilliant. And if that could be linked to 211 when you were calling in, that would even be more brilliant. Then you can make a phone call, report your damage, and at the same time start populating any sort of, you know, paperwork that was needed for any sort of resource. And I know that that's, and I did say magic wand for a very specific reason. I will say our community is very lucky in that our United Way collected money from very generous community members and a disaster recovery fund. And, you know, internally we debated, should we distribute it right away? Should we not distribute it right away? What do we do with that funding? And we made the decision very deliberately to wait and hold on to the money. And I will say I am utterly grateful we did that at this point, because right at this point, when people have used all their other resources, are now sitting there with, you know, a new septic system that needs to happen, or, you know, it's the heater is now completely gone kaput and they need a new one. We have funding available to us readily to distribute to folks and get people kind of moving forward over some of those barriers. So thinking about how do we, you know, decentralize and, you know, put at the grassroots level some of the funding that might be available, you know, through community fundraising. I do know that other states have kind of revolving like community level loan funds that have been really, really helpful for like local communities to, you know, help individuals, and then that have the individuals pay back. That keeps the fund kind of going over time. I know that we've been thinking about, is that possible or not? I know that there's, again, a magic wand might be needed, but I think it's something to think about and consider, especially since Vermont is kind of a more localized way of doing work and thinking about how do we take care of our community members. Those are my short, not magic wand enabled, you know, I can make them happen kind of answers.
Great, thanks, Sarah. It's a good to really think of that magic wand approach. Like, what is it that we're striving for to move forward, and then maybe these smaller pieces start to fit within that greater context. So I want to move to the municipality questions that have come up, and asking if there's a town, if towns could have a way to share plans and may be able to get some ideas that would strengthen their plans. How can towns communicate and coordinate better among themselves in a centralized place and with statewide responders? Did Julie or Bonnie have thoughts there?
I would start by recommending they work with their regional planning commissions, who often help towns develop those plans. Many towns will post that plan on their website. That doesn't help your town get to a town who meets your needs. But talking to both state staff and regional planning commissions can really help if you've got a particular issue in your town that you're trying to address and you need examples from across the state. VLCT can help some, but I'd say the RPCs are the ones on the ground there.
And I know in our region, in Windsor County, the town managers are very well connected. And so we have our own little group that if I'm writing something, I easily shoot out to all of them, hey, would you share what you got going on? And so, I think it's just being connected with other officials in similar communities. So if you're a select board member, connecting yourself to select board members in other towns, or connecting yourself to maybe town managers in other towns or administrators in other towns. But I know in southern Windsor County, we have a pretty strong connection and network down here to just be able to reach out. I don't know if other areas tap out or not.
Well, I was just going to add that, VLCT did stand up a pretty decent resource page and great networking opportunities. But I would second Bonnie's point about regional planning commissions. That's part of why they're here. And VLCT is a good resource there.
Great, thanks. There's one question identified towards Bonnie and Pat, but I think anyone can take a stab as well. But given that DCM wasn't up and running for 8 months and that community response teams were up and running within days of the flooding, how do you see the long-term recovery groups being better included in the Vermont emergency management and municipal plans?
Do you want to start, Bonnie, or you want me to?
You can jump in. You're the long-term recovery focus. So,
well, I think that's an excellent question. And I know for the first time that I've seen, we are having discussions about what does a longer term recovery net infrastructure for Vermont look like. And LTRGs clearly play an important role, particularly in immediate response. And they are volunteer organizations, and which is great. So it's a matter of trying to keep in touch with, okay, who's the leadership position? How do we reach these folks? But I think that's a conversation that's going to continue, is how do we engage and involve those groups, as well as how do we build that network that has, sorry to use a term here, some resilience beyond the flood event, so that we are preparing for the next one and that we're better prepared. Again, whether it be a large statewide event like we've seen or something that's more local. So that is a conversation that is coming. No great answer at the moment, I guess I would say.
agree.
And maybe speak to that a little bit, and or Sarah or Eric or anyone, in terms of that on the backs of volunteers for long-term recovery groups. That's not a sustainable model. And we've seen that happen. And so curious, what is the model that may be able to support those on the ground community groups that are creating that community wellness and community care and support?
Well, sorry, was somebody else wanting to jump in on that, or?
No, go ahead, Pat.
Well, I will add, you're going to find, if you haven't got it in your inbox yet, and hopefully you will, FEMA is sponsoring some regional recovery symposia around the state, south, central, north. And there will be some folks also coming into the Southern Vermont Economic Summit, which I'm forgetting the date, that Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation sponsors, but they're coming in from Miami, Ohio, and they have found a way to institutionalize their long-term recovery groups. And so we're going to do some learning from them. I think looking at what models are in other states, how are they financed, and how can we have something that, as you say, Laura, isn't entirely volunteer oriented, but there's no question those volunteers are going to be critical. They're the immediate boots on the ground, and there's no way we as a state can afford to hire people to do that on a regular basis. So there'll always be a need for that. But how do we support that kind of an effort? It's similar to, municipalities that do emergency management planning. How can we make sure that we're continually helping people, continually training like the next group, helping people understand the resources that are out there. The resources are a huge piece. And, talk about waving the magic wand, Sarah. If I were queen of FEMA, man, would I start from the ground and rebuild FEMA, because I think, to your point, that the multiple applications, multiple pages, and when you're in trauma, that's the last thing you want to be doing. So so we've got to find a way on a state level or a federal level, and I think this is where we need Congress to act, is how can we make FEMA more friendly? Make it the friendly emergency management administration, so that we're not waiting as long as we wait for funding to come through. So there's just a lot of work to do. And I think for us in Vermont, the reality has come through that this is going to be more frequent. 100 and 500 year floodplains are irrelevant, or flood factors are irrelevant. So we've got to say, how are we going to fund this? Similar to how we're funding housing and, you know, so many other crises that our state is facing at a time when we don't have a lot of taxing capability. But we also have a lot of philanthropy and people who step up in a time of need. And I think that's a huge piece of it too.
Thanks, Pat. Love to hear from you, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great, and I encourage the state to continue to look at how we can sustain the LTRGs. I think there's some models that we can look at even in the state. I know that there are some that have been around since Irene and they're still working and still functioning. Our group was born out of a group that we formed during COVID. Using incident command, and that was a grassroots collaborative that was not formalized. And had FEMA not come in and encouraged us to form an LTRG, I don't think we would have, because our system and the way that we had worked was working fine for us. And as we enter into conversations now about what does the future of Learn look like, we are thinking about ways of formalizing kind of the relationships between the different organizations that are part of our collaborative. And so I would encourage the state to kind of talk to what's going on right now and kind of find out what the LTRGs are actually doing, and think about how to build upon that with lessons from other states and from other places. But we've been having to figure this out for the past, I don't know, however many months, and we've come up with some solutions. And I think a lot of the LTRGs would like the support of the state to validate the work, and to use some of the models that are working to kind of systematize across some of the LTRGs. I think it's great. I think it's important. I think it's urgent, because I think the thing that the thing that where the criticism is going to be is if a lot of Vermonters are sitting in substandard housing, or are sitting and not able to find resources because it's complicated and challenging to fill out the forms or to navigate through a wide variety of different services. FEMA and Red Cross comes in at the beginning, but the LTRGs are there months and months and months because we're community members, we're neighbors. And so we need to empower us to figure out how to be there over the long term and have access to the resources we need, including data, including funds, including technical assistance, including training.
Great, thanks for that perspective, Sarah. And it's so much in VCRD's work is working directly with those community groups, how to help support those efforts, and knowing that volunteerism is really what holds a lot of Vermont processes together. And they're coming up with some of these solutions and connections on the ground that then need to be sort of expanded upon, but then also resourced and communicated back and forth. The communication came up, I would say, in a number of folks' comments about how to successfully communicate within your town, but yet also through these organizations. And so that's one thing that if any of the panelists have additional resources for what's been working well, what would be a magic wand? It sounds like one intake form, everything linked together to get that information directly to those communities directly. Jessica put in the survey that Pat referenced in terms of the interagency recovery group hosting series, and the link will take you to what are the priorities that folks want to hear about, and or what's the structure and process. So that is in the chat as well. Let's see. Got a few more minutes for some of the questions that came in from one folks here. It says, how can the state and federal government mitigate the inequalities that result from a reliance on the volunteer leadership labor that we've been talking about? And that privilege regions with well-maintained housing stock and ready crop of residents and professional skills to ramp up. But the lower income regions suffer disproportionately when deferred maintenance is cited as a reason for FEMA insurance denials. Working class towns lack a critical mass of residents able to dedicate wage earning hours to additional community service. And curious specifically, Pat, in the central Vermont region, sort of how you're seeing that response, and really from everyone on the panel here, how can that response be more supportive of those communities that are really being left behind?
I think it's an excellent question, Pam, and it's something we've got to probe. I don't have all the answers to this, but recognizing again that there will always be a need for local volunteer networks, but how can we support them better? And I think it comes down to, and I see Mr. I'm going to massacre your last name, Mark. When you hear there's no funds, that may be no political will. I mean, we need the political will to stand up the funding to be able to assist in these disasters, because they are going to come more frequently. And so I think that voice needs to get heard. And yes, and as I said earlier, a lot of lower income regions suffer disproportionately because that's where it's affordable housing or affordable land. And we've got to figure out how to fix that dynamic. And I was actually starting to put in the chat, FEMA has recently changed their rules to enable deferred maintenance to be potentially covered from FEMA assistance. That's for disasters declared after March 24. So we're SOL, as they say, for our current disaster, but future disasters, that will be a new opportunity. And, the director of FEMA has also talking about how they can get money into people's hands faster. I personally feel the minute the president declares a disaster, a check needs to be written to that state to give the resources to mobilize disaster case managers, mobilize temporary housing a lot faster than it happened for us, or that it continually happens. And I'm sure we're not the only state who feels that, but a reliance on volunteers is always going to be there. The question is, how well can we support those networks in blue sky times so that they are better prepared when it starts raining and or a tornado comes through, or an ice storm, or whatever we may confront with our changing climate. So it's an excellent question. No great answers at the moment.
I think we've got time for one more. And Julie, I want to circle back to your comment around starting to identify everyone in town, but particularly vulnerable populations. And are there tips and tools that you'd want to share of how that is happening, as well as Sarah and Eric, other folks who are how best can communities do that outreach, and what are some of the nuggets of information that you could share today?
Chester is, a lot of that work is being done through our ambulance service and our community health initiative that we have going on, is where a lot of that work is starting, but a lot of it is going to come through this Catalyst program. And our CERT team is going to be kind of responsible for establishing those databases. It's going to be something that's built over time. With just getting the message out to people and opportunities to share or to reach to the town or to the ambulance service is going to be the holder of this information primarily. And just it's just getting the word out to people to know that if you want to be included in this database, reach out and let us know. But when you start reaching out to your emergency services, so police, fire, and ambulance typically know who these individuals are or families are that are vulnerable that are our vulnerable population. They typically know them. And so we are also, to the ones that we feel comfortable, we also don't want to be offensive in how we do it. So reaching out to those groups that we know we can, and then just again, providing opportunities for people to be asked to be on the database. Sarah may have, more wisdom in how to reach those people, but that's what Chester is doing right now.
I don't know if I have any more wisdom at all. I think reaching out to people is challenging. I think there's a couple of things we've learned. One, and I'm not going to say anything that's earth-shattering right now, but one, trust, right, and relationships, right? People are going to talk to people that they trust. And so we've had to do things like reach out to people multiple times over multiple, with multiple different kind of approaches to getting to know them and talking to them. that include that, you know, and that includes everything from going door to door and standing around talking to folks and getting to know the neighbors, and to, you know, showing up at, you know, community events. I mean, we know this as Vermonters, right? Like that's how we work in our community. And I think we just need to know, we need to rely and lean into what we know. It's not going to be social media. It's not going to be, you know, massive texts. It's going to be the people you know, or the people you're going to. I mean, we have a family right now that it took me 3 times to talk to the woman, meaning she was polite, she was nice. Yes, Sarah, that's great, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And when I said to her, hey, you know, would a $250 gift card to Hannaford's be helpful? You know, just to help you get through the month? And she was like, yeah, that'd be amazing. And then the whole story came out. And then we got an assessment into her home. And we found out she was living in terrible conditions, and we've been able to provide help. And because we were then able to provide help, all of her neighbors are now like, oh, hey, who's Lauren? Like, and now I'm getting phone calls from them. And while I want to pretend that Vermont, that's not who we are, that's who we are. And we need to lean into that and figure out how to embrace the fact that it's based on trust, based on relationships. And that's why local level LTRGs are going to be the ones that are going to be the most effective in our communities, right? Because we've created these relationships. We understand how our communities work. I understand that it's very different going into Walcott than, you know, Cambridge, and parts of Jeffersonville are going to be, right? And we all know that about our own little towns. And I think we need to figure out how to make that a system. I don't know what that is. But that's how we get the word out. That's how we talk to people. That's how we build relationships. That's how we help people in the recovery journey. And it is a problem that we're based on volunteers. Everything we do is based on volunteers in Vermont, but there's a reason that it keeps happening. It's because, you know, people keep showing up and wanting to be the trusted neighbor.
Great, thanks, Sarah, for that real examples there, and just how everyone on this call beyond continue to make those connections, build that trust, and be human together in this process of how to think about the future and to live in a place where we can all thrive together. So thank you all. With that, we are right at 11:30, and I want to just thank the panelists again for being with us today. We are compiling all the resources. We'll get any additional ones from the panelists, and we will be posting it, sharing it out with everyone who registered, as well as on the VCRD website. So thank you all for being here, and onward. Here we go.
Thanks, everybody.